Welcome to Video Wissen at TH Rosenheim. We are hosting PTEE conference, the conference on physics teaching in engineering education at the moment. Today we are waiting for the keynote of Peter Riegler, who is the leader of the Bavarian Center of Innovative Teaching in Munich. He will give us a talk on decoding the disciplines, identifying, understanding and overcoming students' barriers to learning much more.
I would like to start this talk by quoting one of the books on decoding and by quoting the very first sentence. Somewhere in the world, at this very moment, a college class is not working. And typically people start to smile, although it's a sad sentence. And the question, I mean, this seems to be an eternal truth, and all of us work to change that truth, but still it seems to be internal, right? I mean, are we really hopeful that this sentence will be false in 30 years? Okay, anyway, why is that so? If you ask instructors, professors, teachers, you basically get one of three answers or classes of answers, and this is well researched. And some people call it the theory 1, 2, and 3, basically reflecting that teachers have a particular view on their job. And if you ask them to explain why classes are not working, well, what I wanted to add is these theories, they develop over time. So newcomers, starters typically have a theory 1 answer, whatever that will be, and then they might progress, and then they have a theory 2 answer, and they might progress and have a theory 3 answer, and 3 encompasses 2 and 1, and 2 encompasses 1, but not the other way around. So the theory 1 answer, why is the class not working? They typically blame it on the students. That could be, you know, they can't do math anymore. They are unmotivated, the secondary school did a bad job, all these sorts of answers, and I guess you are familiar with that, and they're actually not that negative as it seems. I mean, I've heard many, many times during the last 3 days, well, we have to motivate the students, which certainly is true, but it's just want to point out that blames it on an attribute of the student, and psychologists would call this the general attribution error, and question, well, is the problem an attribute of the students or is it something else? So then comes theory 2, instructors start to blame it on themselves. If I only use the right teaching methods, then, you know, my students would learn perfectly. Any guess what theory 3 will be? I mean, what else is there? Yeah? You could blame it on yourself, you could blame it on the student.
Material.
Blaming on the system. What's the system?
Material.
The material. So that's theory 3, blame it on the subject matter. And it's really hard to understand. I can tell from my own development, it's really hard to understand that physics is a difficult subject matter. For me, it was hard to understand. And this is what decoding basically starts with. That's the ground thinking of decoding, that by and large, if teaching fails, it's probably because subject matter is difficult. I mean, this is not denying that it's a question of teaching methodology, and it's not denying that the students comes into the equation, but by and large, it's a system issue, right? So this is what decoding is about. And now if you look at this blame it to the system, blame it to the subject matter approaches, interestingly, there are 3, I would say. One of them is very well known in physics, and that is trying to find out about the difficulties of subject matter by interviewing students. So Lillian McDermott, the North American school, I would say, in an early Piagetian tradition, helped us to understand why physics is difficult. And I would say that's the hour of birth of physics education research, when people started to listen to students, to interview them in a systematic way in order to find out what's difficult with students. There are other approaches. The second one is by self-introspection of the experts. It's pretty well used in research in undergraduate mathematics education. And there's a third one, and that is interview the experts by non-experts. And that's the decoding approach. And all they have their values, right? I mean, the first two particularly look at specific subject matter. The first one looks at students. The second one and the last one, they look at experts. The first two are disciplinary focused. So the physicist interviews the physics students. The last one, the expert is interviewed by non-experts. So the non-experts, the non-physicists in our case, are brought into place in order to help the expert physicist understand what his or her expertise actually is. And I want you to give in my talk a little glimpse into that, how that works. Okay, so I just wanted to point out that this is cross-disciplinary by nature. So if you want to use decoding, you need non-experts to help the experts explicit their expertise. For good reasons, which I'm going to explain. There's another side to the coin of expertise, and that's what we call the curse of expertise or the blind spots of the teacher. It's a two-sided coin, expertise, right? On the one hand, you need it as a qualification for your job. I mean, if you never had studied physics, you can't teach physics. That's for sure. But on the other side, it's an obstacle to teaching, because you are starting to develop blind spots. And most famously, you see that in mathematics, as one can easily see, which is true. The expert easily sees, but the next non-expert doesn't. And that's a problem with expertise. We as experts, we have the privilege to work in our field of expertise every day. I mean, give me a differential equation, I see the solution. That's not because I'm clever, because I had the privilege to work for 25 years almost daily with differential equations. Yeah, I can't perceive anymore what's difficult with differential equations. Well, I learned it meanwhile again. So the basic notion is there are characteristic difficulties with subject matter. And I would like to invite you individually to take a minute to think about what do you perceive, what are the difficulties you perceive that your students struggle with. And if you like, you can use one of these two prompts or another one. So complete a sentence. I can't stand that my students can't solve differential equations, whatever. Take a minute, listen inside yourself, and ask yourself, okay, what are characteristic difficulties of your students that really touch you, that you feel they are important? And it wouldn't hurt if you write them down. I won't collect them, but that helps you to memorize them. So why don't you turn to your neighbor and tell your neighbor about the difficulties your students struggle with, and the neighbor should question whether or not this is related to a blind spot of the expert. Yeah? Could it be that the characteristic difficulties that my students never get to even see what a differential equation is, that I believe that's trivial, because I've never told them, for instance. So I simply want to exchange you the difficulties you perceive, and you might be able to question the other people whether there is something of your expertise connected to that. Okay, just to relate one story that I heard. It was like, okay, my students have a difficult time to identify the underlying physics in problems. So I asked, okay, could you do that easily? Yes, I can. Why is that? Then somebody said experience. And then the person said, well, no, there is more to that. And I'm not uncovering now what is more to that, but the process of uncovering that's the game, the goal of decoding the disciplines. To find out how we as experts do things and make it explicit to us as experts. For us to learn, to learn again, to make it obvious, conscious to us how we approach things. So that's the idea. As one famous textbook author in physics remarked, the problem of how to deduce new things from old and how to solve problems is really very difficult to teach, and I don't really know how to do it. And please go ahead and read the remaining of the statement. So here this person is saying, I'm having a hard time to teach problem solving to physicists, right? To physics students. Sounds familiar? Probably, I guess. And he's admitting, I don't know how to do it. Any idea who he is or she is? It's actually a he. Yeah, that's a quote taken from Feynman's Tips on Physics as the accompanying volume to the Feynman lectures. Okay, so I need to give you some jargon of decoding such that you will be able to follow what I'm going to present you. The jargon of decoding is a basic metaphor, is the metaphor of the bottleneck. And the bottleneck is the place where the students get stuck in the learning process. Problem solving is a prototypical example. On the other hand, we as instructors, we don't get stuck, at least, that easily. So that's the metaphoric idea that there is something related to subject matter that stands in its way of the learning process of many students. And there is definitely the empirical evidence that students get often stuck and are not able to do what they are supposed to do. Yeah, having overcome these bottlenecks basically is a sign, is an attribute of experience, of expertise. You might be familiar with the notion of threshold concepts. It's a similar metaphor. You know, it's the threshold where the students always bump into, and you know, they can't pass, and all of a sudden it works for them. And the two notions are related. Okay, here are some typical bottlenecks which I encountered while working in decoding. Understanding forces interaction. Yeah, well, we all know that this is difficult for students. We know that from the work of Ahrens and McDermott, the FCI, and so on. Modeling real situations, it's well known to you that this is difficult. Reading graphs. And it's amazing that up to here, you find that in all other disciplines, biologists are complaining that their students are not able to read graphs. Chemists, psychologists, and so on. And it's amazingly how different the expertise is. So it shares a lot of things in common, but as I have learned, psychologists read graphs differently than physicists. Reading papers, it's another issue. It's difficult for students, and you have to have reading physics papers comes with a particular expertise which is not exactly the same as reading papers in, say, mathematics or psychology. And the most fun I ever had was decoding the bottleneck when an instructor said, my students never make it to my office hours. And there's a bottleneck there, and we found out why that is the case. The whole idea of decoding, as I've said, is about finding out what experts do such that they don't get stuck where their students get stuck, and make that explicit. And the people who develop decoding put the process into a 7-step process. And I don't want to go into all the details, but I want to show you the basic idea. It starts with define a bottleneck. Just as I had asked you. So what is it that your students typically can't do, but you wished they can do it? And then particular methods or techniques are used to help the expert making explicit his or her expertise. And I will show an example for that. And once that is done, things become rather easy, because then it's only pedagogy anymore. And then what do you have to do? You have to tell, show, or whatever to your students to model your expertise. You certainly will give them practice. You certainly will take care about resistances they have. You certainly will assess whether they master the expertise. And as a good scientist, you will share what you have done. What I want to point out, and which I've learned over the years, is very, very important. There's a bisection. The first two steps, clearly defining where your students have problems with, and trying to analyze what your expertise is, needs to be separated from the teaching. Otherwise, what would happen is, it gets intertwined, and people jump too early into ideas and say, okay, now in teaching I should do this and that, without having properly analyzed the bottleneck and your expertise before. And decoding takes very hard measures to separate these two spheres. And the first one is purely scientific. It's unrelated to teaching, basically. You could call it research and expertise. And once that is done, then comes the teaching. And all of that then is combined to scholar work. Some historic information. The notion of decoding the disciplines in the process was developed some 25 years ago at Indiana University by David Pace and Joan Wittendorf. And if you know a little bit of the history of physics education research, 25 years ago, plus minus, came out the just-in-time teaching book by people from Indiana University. It happened at the same time, and they supported each other. And if you look in the literature of decoding, you find names like Andy Gaffrin and Greg Nowak. If you look in the early literature of just-in-time teaching, we'll find names as David Pace and Joan Wittendorf. So there is a connection. These two, David is a historian, Joan is an educational technologist. So let's actually do it. I have brought with me some videos showing what's typically happening in step 2 of decoding, so where the expertise is made transparent. There are many ways to do that. One way, which is often used because it has its attractiveness, is by interviewing experts. Two non-experts interview one expert and help the expert to understand how she or he is able to do what his or her students are not able to do. And the example I've brought with you is a class in aeronautical engineering. So it's not quite physics. The class basically, it gives you some background information that you need. The class is basically project-based. So students choose a project in aeronautical engineering, work on that over the course of a semester, and then they have to hand in a report. And one of these projects could be that they should design a component of an airplane, for instance, a row of seats in an airplane. So where's the problem? The bottleneck, or the bottlenecks, as phrased by the instructors, were like these. The instructor said, my students find it difficult to identify critical components, to identify and distinguish load cases, and to document them in a comprehensible and systematic manner. And I was puzzled in the beginning, was saying, okay, that's basically 3 bottlenecks. And the instructor was saying, yeah, I guess it's one and the same. So you might think for a moment, why is it difficult for students to identify the critical components of a row of seats, to identify and distinguish load cases, which basically is forces acting on the seats, and why it is difficult for students to document their results. What is quite typical for decoding interviews is there are 3 persons involved. One is the expert, and 2 are non-experts which are there to help to make the expertise explicit, and they must be from a difficult discipline. Otherwise, they would conspire in complaining about students. And in that case, it was one from law and one from physics. The last one happened to be me. Okay, before I show you parts of such an interview, let me tell you about a number of typical moves that are used in decoding interviews. Typically, the expert is asked to identify a concrete, specific situation. So the expert comes in and says, my students are not able to document, which is vague and broad. And we ask the expert then typically, okay, give us one specific situation where students need to document something. That's very important. In that case, the expert suggested to have the use case of constructing the row of seats, but later on changed it to connecting a projector like that to the ceiling, as we normally have in lecture halls. Also very important is that the interviewees, the experts, need to take on the role of an expert, but not the role of an instructor. The expertise here is not teaching, the expertise here is aeronautical engineering. And to separate that out is very important. It's again the same thing as I've shown before, expertise versus teaching. Otherwise, it will be, the interview will become a discussion of teaching methodology, which is too early at that stage. What happens and what you will see is in decoding interview is basically a relentlessly repetition of how do we do it, how do we do it, how do we do it in various forms. Doesn't work always. There is a very helpful question which will be used here again, is asking the expert what would happen if an expert did not do what you say the expert has to do. And of course, you can paraphrase, summarize, and so on. Okay, so let's delve into that. Meet Jutta on the right. Jutta is a professor in aeronautical engineering, and there are two interviewers who agreed to help Jutta to understand what her expertise is, such that she can identify load cases, that she can deliver a proper documentation.
Du hattest bei der Flugzeugsitzreihe gesagt, die Studierenden müssen Aufgabenstellung identifizieren und die muss Sinn ergeben.
Richtig.
Woran machst du fest? Was sind deine Entscheidungskriterien dafür, dass eine Fragestellung sinnvoll ist oder nicht sinnvoll ist?
Ich mache das, ich antworte jetzt mal, wie es bei mir ist, ich mache das daran fest, dass ich mir überlege, würde ich dieses Teil berechnen oder würde ich sagen, reicht erstmal, passt, wird nicht versagen. Ist vielleicht im ersten Step überdimensioniert, aber das macht am Anfang nichts.
Woran machst du das fest? Wie genau tust du das?
Genau, woran mache ich das fest? Ich mache das daran fest, dass ich mir überlege, das wirken Kräfte in bestimmten Lastfällen auf die Konstruktion. Welches Teil wird als erstes versagen, so wie es im Moment konstruiert und dimensioniert ist? Also ich versuche die Schwachstellen, die mechanischen, die Sollbruchstellen praktisch in der Konstruktion zu erkennen und schaue dann drauf, ob die ausreichend dimensioniert sind.
Das können aber jetzt ein Studierender nicht so einfach nachmachen, diese Vorstellung.
Leider nicht.
Wie funktioniert die?
Die Vorstellung funktioniert bei mir so, dass ich tatsächlich in einem inneren Film das Teil sehe, wie die Konstruktion kaputt geht. Wie sie sich verformt, wie sie irgendwo bricht, wie sie reißt, wie sie splittert oder beult. Und diesen inneren Film haben die Studierenden nicht.
Wer hat das Drehbuch für den inneren Film geschrieben?
Sehr gute Frage. Wer hat das Drehbuch für den inneren Film geschrieben? Ich selbst, indem ich immer viel kaputt gemacht habe. Und dabei geguckt habe, wie versagt das?
Das ist tatsächlich die Erfahrung, das mal gesehen zu haben.
Wahrscheinlich ja.
So you get the idea of continuously asking, how do you do that? How do you do that? Basically in a painstaking way. And I just want to tell you, by now we have not actually nothing. I mean, she is saying, I have the experience. And well, it's clear that she has acquired experience over the course of her life, but she needs to transfer her experience to the students. And it's not explicit to her what her experience actually is. And there's this vague idea of the inner movie and so on. One further, how do you do that question? And then I invite you to do some decoding.
Nehmen wir lieber diesen Beamer, weil den kann sich jeder vorstellen, glaube ich, ne? Der hier im Raum hängt. Und wenn das jetzt meine Konstruktion wäre und ich müsste dazu eine relevante Berechnung abgeben, dann wäre zum Beispiel ein wirklich kritischer Fall, dass er von der Decke runterfällt. Ja, würde ich sagen, da könnte, im einfachsten Fall wird nur der Beamer beschädigt, aber im schlimmsten Fall kommt eine Person zu Schade. Also definitiv kritisch. Okay. Dann überlege ich mir, welches Bauteil muss versagen, damit er von der Decke fällt. So bestimmt nicht die Kabelverbindung. Der Stecker, wo das Kabel reingesteckt ist. Das wird nicht der Auslöser sein.
Moment, wir können kurz mal einhaken. Wir hatten jetzt quasi schon, Sie haben sich entschieden für den kritischen Fall anhand dieses Beamers. Genau. Wie ist diese Entscheidung gefallen? Weil das muss ja der Studierende auch machen, sich entscheiden.
Genau, ich muss mir überlegen, was kann damit passieren.
Wie haben Sie die Entscheidung jetzt gemacht?
Indem ich mir wieder wie in so einem Kinofilm vorgestellt habe, was kann alles damit passieren.
Genau, jetzt sind wir an der Stelle, wo wieder rausgebracht sind. Genau, okay. Okay, dann müssten quasi Ihre Studierenden, wenn ich richtig verstanden habe, so eine Art visuellen, filmischen Erfahrungsschatz sammeln, wo Sie das ähnlich nachvollziehen können. Ist das
ja, wahrscheinlich ist das das Problem. Das könnte gut sein.
Okay, so we might have progressed a little bit. So she told us there are certain questions she asks, but then when we probed her how she asked the questions, then it's the inner movie again. And then something turned, we as the interviewers realized we were stuck, right? There was always the idea of, I have the experience and the students don't have the experience. And then something happened.
Also wir gehen jetzt in dem Szenario davon aus, Studierende haben, ich nenne das mal Testfälle, Belastungsfälle, ist das ein brauchbarer Vokabel, kreiert. Und für dich ist erstmal das Wichtigste zu entscheiden, sind diese konstruierten Belastungsfälle sinnvoll untersucht zu werden?
Genau, erstmal möchte ich vor allen Dingen verstehen, was haben Sie jetzt da berechnet? Weil wir hatten ja gesagt, eigentlich wollen wir vor allen Dingen auf das dritte nachvollziehbar und systematisch dokumentieren. Das heißt, ich erwarte eine Überschrift. Was für eine Berechnung kriege ich jetzt hier? Kriege ich normale Benutzung, Missbrauch oder Notlandebedingungen? Diese Überschrift fehlt schon.
Okay.
Damit fängt es schon an, obwohl ich sage, die möchte ich gerne haben. Und dann welchen Teil haben Sie sich ausgesucht?
Warum möchtest du die Überschrift gerne haben?
Damit ich verstehen kann, was Sie mir da mit Ihren Formeln und Ihren Zahlen sagen wollen. Weil mich tatsächlich die Zahlen gar nicht so interessieren, sondern mich interessiert ja vielmehr, welche Schlussfolgerungen Sie daraus ziehen, wie Sie das Ganze auch in Ihr Projekt einbetten. Ich will ja keine Mathematikprüfung nochmal nachvollziehen.
Was würde denn passieren, wenn ein Experte, eine Expertin diese Überschrift nicht drüber schreibt? So wie es sie steht.
Ja, also wenn man es jetzt mal im Ernstfall nimmt, im Flugzeugbau sind halt Berechnungen, dokumentationspflichtige Unterlagen, die im Falle eines Flugzeugunglücks von der Zulassungsbehörde oder der Flugunfalluntersuchungsbehörde eingefordert werden. Und wenn dort eine solche aussagekräftige Überschrift fehlt, ist das ein Indikator dafür, dass die Person, die die Berechnung durchgeführt hat, nicht qualifiziert ist. Das heißt, entweder die Person, die sie beauftragt hat, ist haftbar, oder aber wenn die Person eigenmächtig eine Freigabe erteilt hat, ist sie persönlich haftbar. Das heißt, die gute Dokumentation ist gleichzeitig die Absicherung dafür, dass ich nicht irgendwann mal im Gefängnis lande.
So, what's the instructor's tacit knowledge? Could you perceive that from the interview? So what does the expert do, which most likely the students don't do, and hence get stuck in that process of identifying loads and documenting their project work? Did you get an idea? Yeah, so Elmar gets the microphone. What you are saying is she's placing that in an expert setting, and there the idea of liability is very important. Is it important in the context of teaching?
Yes.
Yes. Is it important in the context of teaching? You're saying yes. I sum that up. What you are saying is the report has a purpose. And eventually the purpose is not for getting a grade, but for the students to learn what's in a documentation and why it's necessary and what's the implication of that. Yeah? You could end up in prison if you don't document properly. She never told her students so far, because it was implicitly clear for her that's what you write documentations for, right? So basically that's it. And that's why these seemingly three bottlenecks are so intertwined. Yeah, to identify the critical load cases, what is critical? Well, critical is where people get damaged and I end up in prison. Yeah, this is a typical blind spot. This is not about cognitive difficulties here in that case, like constructing an inner image of forces or something like that. Yeah, in that case, it's a very clear example of a relatively, seemingly trivial blind spot of the expert, which the expert has never made explicit to her students. Now we can go into teaching. So what's the implication for teaching? Now we can start asking, what does that mean for teaching? And in that case, the instructor said, well, I guess the only thing I have to do, I need to tell my students. And that's what she did. And then half a year later, she sent us an email, and that's a quotation from the email. And I invite you to read that. So you see, again, teaching is a complex matter. Sometimes it's a seemingly small, trivial things, and if you change them, the whole game changes. And decoding is about finding out these small things. What decoding also does, it's a mean to escape the loneliness of teaching. Because you sit together with other teachers, instructors, who help you to improve your teaching. And I find that very important, to talk about teaching. It's also a working area for cross-disciplinary faculty learning communities. So if you want to do something meaningful with colleagues from the philosophy department and from the language department, that might be something worthwhile to consider. Nowadays, where scholarship of teaching and learning is on the road, become prominent, it's a blueprint for that. Start with the research question, why is it difficult that my students can't do this and that? And in the modern area, where everybody is hungry for quick reliefs, decoding is really slow food. It's for the connoisseurs of teaching. It's for those people who take their time and say, okay, I invest this 1 hour of interview to really learn what makes teaching difficult and what my blind spots are. And that's what I want to end. Thank you. The question is, how difficult is it to find like-minded people, and what's the experience after that? Once you found them and you started to eat slow food, typically people enjoy it. That's the easy part to answer. Since you are from Leuven, there is a decoding group at FH Aachen. I can give you the contact. Fachhochschule Aachen. Miriam Barnard and other ones. So since it's regionally close, you might get in contact with them and visit them and start the first interview or something like that. The question is, you said it's difficult for you to phrase it. It's difficult for me to repeat it. So is it on the disciplinary level or is it on the instructor level? I would say it's on both. you know, there is the instructor who is typically desperate. Yeah? Teaching does not work, so the instructor is seeking help. The underlying idea is it's not the fault of the instructor, it's the fault of the discipline. And that's why it's disciplinary as well. Yeah? It's on the instructor level because the instructor is seeking help. But typically the focus is not on the instructor, it's on the discipline. And then you ask whether it's helpful for the instructor or for the interviewer, for both. But the interviewer are there to serve the instructor. But the interviewer are learning a lot for themselves as well, of course. But that's you know, that's a side casualty, so to say, which is accepted and welcome. The question is, why are there two interviewers necessary? There are many reasons for that. One reason is that the second interviewer serves as a watchdog. Because sometimes it happens that the interview gets into teaching. You know, there is the biologist interviewing the quantum physicist. And the biologist gets so interested in the subject matter because now he has the opportunity to learn quantum physics from the expert. And the second person is there to monitor the interview and saying, stop, this is not what's supposed to happen here. That's one of the reasons why there is two. Another reason is interviewing is really demanding cognitively, and it's good to share that on two brains, and other reasons.